In this video, I wanted to look at an Android app that was reading a JSON file as a raw resource. The topic happens to be racehorses, and the code can be found at the URL seen there. So this is the app in an AVD, and we see a spinner, which has some famous racehorses, some of the more recent ones missing, but some famous old racehorses. And then you pick from the spinner a racehorse, and it tells you some information about the racehorse, who the horse's parent was, who the trainer was. This is the silks, the picture that what the jockey would wear when riding that horse. And there is this show clip, which is going to have a new so-called intent and move over to YouTube and show a clip on YouTube of this horse in a race. Okay, so there is a tick. Okay, so some commercial and then a video on Seattle Slope. Okay. So let's look at our resources. First, our layout. There was a text view at the top just saying choose a horse, which is the label for the spinner. Then there is the spinner, which was that sort of drop down of horse names. There was a text view telling you this is a text view just saying sire. And then I had a separate text view to actually display the sire. And then I had a text view just saying trainer, and another text view which will display the actual trainer. And then the image view, which was for the silks. And then a button, which took us to that new intent, which took us over to YouTube. So that is the layout. In Drawable, we have a bunch of these are the silks, but they're named after the horse names, and we're obeying our normal naming scheme: small letters and underscores, no spaces. I could have numbers, but I don't in this case. And then in raw, so I have in resources, I made a raw folder. Right click and choose a new directory, call it raw, small letters. And then I have horse racing JSON, and again, small letters. And then here is that JSON. So JSON stands for JavaScript object notation. And I tend to mispronounce JSON, and most people call it JSON. Anyway, so we start with a curly bracket, which means we're starting with an object. So JSON supports objects and arrays and sort of key value pairs. And so what we first encounter here is a curly bracket, meaning that we're starting with an object. That object has a property called horses. So this is a key value pair. So there's a property whose key is horses, or the name of the property is horses. And then its colon separates the key from the value. And this value of horses happens to be a square bracket. So it happens to be an array. And then that array signaled by the square bracket array. And then we have the elements of the array. So array, we expect to have a number of elements, and the elements of the array are objects again. So I'm seeing another curly bracket here. And then those objects are a set of key value pairs: the horse name, the horse rank, the horse rating, the horse silks, the horse sire, the horse trainer, the horse jockey, the horse YouTube code. So that is the information about one horse. So that's the information for one horse object. Here's another horse object, and on down. So here's my last horse object. No comma here because it's the last one, the end of the square bracket. So that's the end of the array of horses. and then the end of the object. So this overall object had just one property. Okay, so that's how this particular JSON file is organized. Other organizations are possible, but in general, it supports objects, arrays, and key value pairs, but they can be in various combinations. So that's the JSON file we're going to read. Now let's go over to the main activity and see what we have here. So we have in the imports, a lot of imports, buttons and image views and array adapters and spinners and text views. And I have a toast and some things for JSON. So all sorts of imports for this project. Here is the relationship between the layout, interface, and code. So I have a place to display the sire and the trainer of the horse. So I have text views for that. So that's these first two. The silks is that picture of what the jockey wears, and that was an image view. I have a button to take one over to YouTube, and I have a spinner, which will be loaded up with horse names. Oops. So now we want to, next thing we want to do is we want to read this raw resource. And so that is here, context resources, open raw resource, then r.raw.horse racing. So we're looking in the resources, specifically under the raw, for something with the name horse racing. And there it is. Again, no file extensions in the name of a resource. And that creates for us an input stream. We are going to read the entire file. So while the JSON that I've written down here looks to be sort of line-based, so that I put certain things only on one line by themselves. That's not, that's just like the way I wanted to format this JSON to make it easy to read, but that's not an aspect of JSON. That JSON is not line delimited. So it's all about the curly brackets, the square brackets, the colons, quotation marks, and so on, commas, but not line based. So I'm going to read the entire file. It's not that big. If it was a very large file, we might have to do some additional work, but the file's not that large. So we're just reading the entire file at once, read all the bytes, and use sort of the normal default character set. Now we've read in that, so this is just a string. Here it is, toString. We've read a file and cast it as a string. And now we're saying, but it happens to be JSON. So now we're sort of parsing and interpreting it in terms of JSON. So taking those curly brackets and square brackets and so on, and sort of pulling it apart. And you recall in the JSON file, then it started with a curly bracket. So it started as an object. And so that's how I started here, JSONObject. So my JSONObject is the overall, everything that's in the file, which was an object specified by that Java notation. Then, as you also recall, the first property of that object was called horses, and that was an array. So here we are saying, go to that object that I just created and get the JSON array, get the property called horses, which happens to be a JSON array. So now I have a JSON array. So there are these JSON objects and JSON arrays, and then there'll also be getString, which we'll see below. So we are sort of parsing the JSON, but we've had to sort of see the JSON. We can't just sort of go in blind, or it's much harder work if you go in blind. So sort of always look at the JSON that you intend to read. Okay, next I want to load up that spinner, and I want much simpler or sort of arrayed list for doing that. I just decided I wanted the rank of the horse and the name of the horse. So I'm going to loop over this JSON array. And so I can't loop over the object, but the object at a property, which was an array. So I have that array now, and I'm looping over that, and I'm pulling out from that. So I'm using a counter here. So I'm taking sort of a counting approach to this loop, and I'm getting the object in the ith position from the array. And then it has a property called horse rank, which is and its value is a string. So I'm going to my array, going specifically to the ith object in the array. I'm getting the property that is labeled horse rank, and it's a string. And I call that horse rank, and then I call horse name, and then I'm concatenating them together and adding them to an array list here of horse rank and name. That's going to be what I use to load up my spinner. So that's what comes next. So I set up an array adapter. Context of this, I have two different styles. I started off with a simple style, and then I gave it this other style. This other style gives me sort of a little more space between when the spinner drops down. This second sort of formatting gives a little more space between them. So you can decide if you like that or not. If you don't like as much space, then comment this line 56 out. But I'm setting up the array adapter with the context of this, using this originally the simple spinner item, and here is that array, which was a code array. This is changing the style of the dropdown, and this is using the array adapter to populate the spinner. When the user chooses a horse, that's the onItemSelected listener. So here's that handler. When nothing is selected, I do nothing, but when something is selected, and I usually work with these two middle arguments, the view, which is what you see when it drops, and which is a view typically for a simple spinner like this, a text view, and then an I is the sort of the position in that sort of array, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so the first thing I'm using is taking that view, casting it as a text view, and then displaying its text in a toast. So just to sort of say I have access to that information. But more I'm going to work with the I, which is the position in the array. So I go back to my array, my JSON array, getJSONObject I, and then there's a sire property. And I'm putting that in the sire text view. And then I'm getting the my JSON array, the ith object in that array, and getting the string with a key of horse trainer, and putting that as the text of the text view for the trainer. I am doing the silks. I'm not going to display that as text. I'm going to display that as an image. But so here's JSON_array, getJSONObject I, getString horse silks. But that is a resource name. We saw that in the drawables, those resource names. And then we are going to look for that name within the set of drawable things within our package namespace. We're going to get the identifier. We're going to get the corresponding ID. And then that will be the ID of the image. Say we chose Damascus. It would be then whatever ID behind the scenes stands for Damascus. And then we're going to use that number, that ID, to set the image of the image view. Okay, almost done. So now if they click the button, we have an on-click listener, and we are going to the spinner and getting the item position. So up above, we were talking about that I, which horse was chosen. And so that's what we're getting out of the spinner. It's not a spinner event this time, so it's not handed to us, but we still have access to it. Go to the spinner, get the selected item position, and I called it, for whatever reason, ID. I am trying to use my JSON array to get the JSON object at that position, and this time get the value that has a key of horseshoe tube code, and that I called then here YTC. And then in YouTube, if you, there's a certain URL, and then the last part of that URL is a code. And so I have the code for these clips on the horses. So I'm then putting together, concatenating https://www.youtube.com/watch ? V equals, and then that number. And then I'm setting that up as sort of a new intent. So this was going to, that's what, when we saw it in action, that's what sort of we slid over to YouTube and could watch the video after the commercial. And that's it. We're at the bottom of the program. That's what I wanted to show you. So thanks